This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. On today's show, as we celebrate Independence Day, we talk about two issues central to the history of America: the promise of immigrants and the question of how much government is best. First, Congressman Raul Grijalva of Arizona, the co-chair of the Progressive Caucus, says the Supreme Court decision throwing out most of his state's immigration law is an opportunity for Democrats. He says Democrats need to take the high ground and challenge Republicans to work on a bipartisan overhaul of federal immigration policy. Next, we chat with historian Michael Lind, who has written a book exploring cycles of American history in which the argument between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton keeps being played out. He explains how both sides abandon the free market when it serves a larger national interest. And Bill Press talks with political scientist Norm Ornstein, whose book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks, sums up the state of Republican-incited paralysis in Washington. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Mitt Romney says Arizona's discredited immigration restrictions was model legislation. But now that the Supreme Court thinks otherwise, what is Romney's backup plan? Nothing, says Congressman Raul Grijalva. He says the Supreme Court decision gives Democrats an opportunity to force Republicans into truly bipartisan moves to reform federal immigration policy. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Congressman Raul Grijalva represents the 7th District, the southwestern part of Arizona, and is co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Congressman Grijalva, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Now that Arizona's controversial law has mostly been overturned by the Supreme Court, what can Congress do to fix our immigration system? And will Republicans work with Democrats on a solution?
Yeah, great question, because I think what the court said in admonishing Congress was to say, when they ruled that states can't go willy-nilly decide what their own immigration policies are going to be, and that effectively was at the heart of 1070 and other pieces of legislation that we've seen in Alabama, Georgia, Indiana, Utah. By doing that, they effectively said this is a constitutional privilege of the federal government and Congress. So that was an important point. But and admonishing Congress by saying, have a dialogue with the American people. You're responsible for this. And if the system's broken, you need to fix it. And I think that the Democrats are going to say, let's sit down and try to figure this out. And I predict, and I'm almost certain, that we are going to get no participation on the part of the Republicans in the House, and certainly not in the Senate. The reason being both political, continuing to bait a very extremist base that, quite frankly, they're afraid of. And in doing so, I think perpetuate a broken system on the border that they can continue to harp about and complain about without them not wanting to do anything about it. I think it's an advantage for Democrats to step up and say, we're ready to go to work. Court has said it's our responsibility, struck down state-by-state immigration. Now let's do it. I think that's what our Democrats need to do in Congress, and say we're ready to work on a solution, bipartisan, that's humane, that's comprehensive, that includes security, and kind of force the Republicans to be the obstructions they've been on this issue for the last 6 years. And they're very quick at blaming the president for not fixing it. Romney's running around the country saying that. And yet he said, I will veto the DREAM Act if it ever came to my desk. So they're speaking out of both sides of their mouth, saying, and now I think we need to challenge them. And by challenging them, I think people will begin to see what the true obstacle is to trying to fix this broken immigration system in this country. The obstacle is going to be the Republican Party. I think we need to challenge them on it.
Congressman, what role did the president and the Justice Department play in fighting the law? And when you asked them to get involved, how did they respond?
They responded rapidly and immediately. The Justice Department, within a short period of time, had done the research and was in court in the Ninth Circuit against 1070, and the president early on spoke out against it. This is not what we should do. It shouldn't be state by state. Congress needs to come up with comprehensive reform. I'm ready to work with you, and that was repeated over and over again. So the role, I think, was very critical. His executive order on the DREAM Act on young people was very timely, and it was uplifting to an entire community. Very, very humane and very symbolic. And so, the president has been engaged in pushing Congress to do something, and the Justice Department was instrumental in calling the unconstitutionality to question, taking it to court, and then having 3/4 of it upheld by the Supreme Court.
We're speaking with Congressman Raul Grijalva, representing the 7th District of Arizona, also co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Mitt Romney called the law a model for the country. Now that his model is unconstitutional, what's the Republican backup plan?
They have none, and that is the whole premise, of what the court ruled on. That it is the responsibility of the federal government. You have Mitt Romney running for president with no position on the issue, just depending on where he wants to pander. On one end he'll be harsh and strict on immigration. When he goes to Naleo, he says, well, I'm open to having a discussion about something. Nobody knows what that something is. So he also said he would veto the DREAM Act, an act that 64% of the American people agree with and support. So not even is it politically smart in that sense. But he doesn't have a plan. All through the primary, the Republicans running in their primary try to outdo each other on how harsh they could be on the issue of immigration, how stern they could be, and how punitive they could be. Problem with Romney is that rhetoric is his. He owns it. And I don't see him coming up with anything because it is an issue that the party doesn't embrace, and it's an issue that they feel is not part of their constituency. So I think they're going to use it, as they've always used it the last 3 election cycles, as a wedge issue, as a divisive issue, as an issue in which to cause fear in other Americans. And it's cynical, but because that's been a campaign tactic, it's kind of impossible for Romney to have anything other than no response or the stern, strict response that he's been given in the past.
Do you think Republicans will be able to repair the damage they've done to their relationship with American Hispanics?
It would have to be an epiphany of some magnitude where they would come to the realization that the demographic shift in this country, regardless of what you want to do, how strict you want to be, how anti-immigrant you want to be, the demographic shift is a reality. It's inevitable. It's irreversible. And I think they are going to have a very difficult time trying to come back from the hole that they dug for themselves with Hispanic America. Mm-hmm. I just don't. There is, and it's not just the issue of immigration. Their disinvestment in education, their attacks on healthcare, where the Latinos have the highest percentage of uninsured people in this country, resident citizens, legal status, the highest percentage, and the highest underachievement in education. The highest unemployment in parts of the country. So, when that community sees that their road to aspire to be middle class, their road to opportunity is effectively being blocked by the Republican Party in terms of them not wanting to invest in any of the programs that are going to make this growing community better educated and more prepared to contribute to this country, they know what's up. The Latino voter is a smart voter. They know who their friends are, and they know who are not their friends. And at this point, the Republican Party is not seen as a friend. It's seen as someone who is purposely singling out that community. And it's a deep, deep hole. And there's a generational shift going on in our community, and that generation is very, very pro and very strongly Democratic.
Congressman, what can Democrats do to keep pushing reform? If Republicans are stubborn, should Democrats just kind of wait and see what happens, or is there anything positive that can be done now?
I think the positive that can be done now is, as I said earlier on, challenge the Republicans. We're willing to work in a bipartisan fashion with you. Let's sit down and work on something that is good for America in terms of fixing this broken immigration law. I think that challenge is important, to put them on the spot, and so that they either maintain the very narrow rhetoric that they have now, or they sincerely want to do something. I doubt they sincerely want to do something. But my point being, I think we need to challenge. The other thing is how we talk about immigration. These are Americans to be that we're talking about. These are the future Americans. And I think we've got to start talking about immigration in different terms. And I think Democrats can set a tone for this discussion that's inclusive, and that it's about keeping America united. The divisions 1070 caused in Arizona can't and shouldn't be replicated across this nation. And so I think we have two. We have to take the high ground on tone, and we have to challenge them to work with us and try to figure something out.
Does the message have to be any different from Democrats to apply more pressure on Republicans, or do they just kind of stick with what they've been going with up to now?
I think the message has to be we're ready to work. We've proposed immigration reform. It's on the table. Whatever you have is on the table. We're ready to work in a bipartisan way to begin to solve this problem, as the Supreme Court has admonished us to do, and as the American people are asking us to do something. It's a difference between the tone should be about we're ready to work and do something versus the tone we've heard from the Republicans, which is we don't want to do anything because they have not proposed anything. And I think the more we expose the fact that they're exploiting this issue political instead of trying to solve the problem, I think it's to our advantage.
Okay. Congressman Raul Grijalva represents the 7th District of Arizona, is co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Congressman Grijalva, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to speaking again with you soon.
Thank you very much.
And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going, and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up in just a few minutes, the political divide in American history has not really been right versus left, but Hamilton versus Jefferson, says historian Michael Lind. And both sides favor big government when it suits larger national issues. But right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Two wrongs don't make a right, as my old Texas mama used to say. But apparently, 5 of the justices on our Supreme Court didn't have mamas with such ethical sensibilities. Or perhaps they're just ignoring their mama's wisdom now in order to impose their extremist political agenda on you and me. That agenda became astonishingly clear in 2010 when the black-robed cabal of Alito, Kennedy, Roberts, Scalia, and Thomas hung their infamous Citizens United edict around America's neck. It allowed unlimited sums of corporate cash to spew into our elections, effectively legalizing the wholesale purchase of America's elected officials. In his decision, Supreme Joker Anthony Kennedy drew from his deep well of political ignorance and judicial arrogance to declare that these gushers of special interest money, quote, do not give rise to corruption or the appearance of corruption. Is he on the court or in a comedy club? Not only were Kennedy and his fellow corporatists wrong on the substance of their decree, but also ridiculously wrong on the politics. You don't need a law degree to see that CEOs are presently flooding the presidential and congressional races with hundreds of millions of corporate campaign dollars, gleefully corrupting the political process to buy government policy for their own gain. And now, the same 5 judicial extremists have added a third egregious wrong to their agenda of turning the people's rights over to soulless corporations. On June 25th, they struck down a century-old Montana law enacted directly by the people through a 1912 initiative vote that banned corporate money from corrupting that state's elections. This is Jim Hightower saying these 5 are not merely judicial activists. They're dangerous political hacks fronting for corporate power to pull off a plutocratic coup on America.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Historian Michael Lind goes back into American history and explains how Americans contradict themselves. The political fault line is not really liberal versus conservative, but Jeffersonian versus Hamiltonian. He says Americans are Jeffersonian in belief, but Hamiltonian in practice. Joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Michael Lind, who is a co-founder of the New America Foundation and policy director of its economic growth program. He's a frequent contributor to the New York Times and the Financial Times, also writes a column for Salon, and his latest book is A Land of Promise, An Economic History of the United States. Michael, thanks so much for joining us again today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks for having me back.
Well, always nice to have you. And, you know, according to your book, A New American Republic has coincided with the invention of each new technology, going back to the steam engine. But doesn't technological advance precede economic realignment by quite a long time?
Yes, it does, and economic realignment precedes political realignment. That's why I argue in my book, Land of Promise, that there's a time lag of a generation or two between modernizing our political and legal system and the modernization of the economy in response to new technologies.
You write that there is a long tradition of industrial policy being practiced throughout American history, contrary to the perception that there were a nation of small farmers and small business people. So do you mean that big government helped spur some of the great corporate and military institutions of our time?
Yes, you know, we say we're a capitalist country, but we forget that in addition to private sector capitalism, there is state capitalism, where the government literally is the venture capitalist. It's sometimes the biggest customer for a new industry. So, for example, Congress funded the early development of the telegraph. It funded the transcontinental railroads with land grants and subsidies. In the case of the aviation industry, the civilian aviation industry was deliberately created and fostered in the United States by the use of subsidies through the Postal Service, airmail, as well as the fact that the military, from the Wright brothers onwards, around World War I, was the largest and most important customer of American aircraft manufacturers. So if you look at everything from the Internet, which was literally created by the Pentagon and other federal agencies, to nuclear energy, and even to radio. The radio industry was created by the government in the 1920s under the leadership of the Navy. And what was originally a public-private radio monopoly was spun off into RCA, NBC, ABC, and the networks. So there's always been a fruitful interaction between federal government, state capitalism, and private sector commercial capitalism.
And to me, as I listen to you answer that question, that speaks very highly of big government. And yet right now, big government is really frowned upon by a lot of folks. As you're reading the papers, we need less government, but that doesn't seem like that would be the right answer, in your opinion.
Well, America is Hamiltonian in its practice and Jeffersonian in its beliefs. That is, the Hamiltonians have always believed there's a role for a big but limited government cooperating with business to adapt technology, create a more productive society. The Jeffersonians have been suspicious of everything big, not only big government, but big banking, big labor. The conservatives are now attacking environmentalism as big green. So big is a pejorative in this Jeffersonian language, and Americans, simply contradict themselves. So, for example, if you look at the ultimate big government programs, which are Social Security and Medicare, these are literally socialist programs, right? People don't call them that, but that's what they are. Even a majority of Republicans, as well as Democrats, love Social Security and Medicare, and at the same time, politicians get elected running against socialism and big government programs. So there's kind of a divided mentality in the United States, which the conservatives have been able to exploit in recent years by denouncing big government. Their actual alternatives are not free markets, but it's a kind of crony capitalist contractor system. That is, they don't want to get rid of Social Security and Medicare totally. They simply want to divert the tax funds to their friends in the private sector, so that you have Wall Street-based savings accounts instead of Medicare, and you'd have Social Security would be replaced by stock market accounts invested for retirement purposes, but you would still be taxed to fund these. And so one of the great frauds on the public is the idea that the Republican Party stands for market provision. It actually stands for taxpayer-subsidized crony capitalism.
Michael Lind is who we're speaking with. He's co-founder of the New American Foundation and policy director of its economic growth program. His latest book is A Land of Promise, An Economic History of the United States. And Michael, what other aspects of American economic history do you think will surprise readers of Land of Promise the most?
Well, I think they'll be surprised not only by the role of government, but also by the sometimes constructive role of some of the industrialists who have been demonized, including by a lot of liberals. We always go on about how terrible the Gilded Age was, but actually workers and ordinary Americans saw massive gains in their living standards in spite of the repression of much of the workforce, in the railroad industry, for example, and in manufacturing. At the same time, we idealize these Southern planters, like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. But if from a pure human rights standpoint, Andrew Carnegie and J.P. Morgan, the man, not the bank, the financier, were vastly more enlightened and treated their workers better than these Southern slave owners. So I think we need to kind of take a second look at some of the heroes and demons in American history, and particularly the antebellum period and the antebellum slave owners. I think get off pretty scot-free, whereas the late 19th century industrialists are held to much higher standards.
Now, also in your book, Land of Promise, you trace much of the current economic debate right back to the original distinction between small government followers of Thomas Jefferson and big government followers of Alexander Hamilton. Does that divide correspond to the one between left and right today?
No, it doesn't. In Land of Promise, I argue that the really basic traditions in the U.S., at least when it comes to the economy, are Hamiltonian supporters of developmental capitalism and Jeffersonian supporters of small enterprise-oriented what's called producerism. The Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian traditions each have a right wing, a left wing, and a center. So, for example, Herbert Hoover was a Hamiltonian of the right. Theodore Roosevelt and arguably Franklin Roosevelt were Hamiltonians of the left. William Jennings Bryan was a Jeffersonian of the left, and I think Ronald Reagan was a Jeffersonian of the right. So that the existing left-right division, which only goes back in its modern form couple of decades in the United States. It really doesn't map onto these more deep-rooted Hamiltonian versus Jeffersonian traditions.
Do you think that America will remain a land of promise?
Yes, in the long run, I'm an optimist. If you look at the basic assets of the United States compared to other countries in the world, we're almost incredibly self-sufficient in natural resources compared to, say, China or India or Western Europe. We have the third largest population in the world, and one which attracts immigrants, unlike our major competitors. We have still the world's best R&D base, although we need to be concerned about losing too much industry to foreign competition. So if the United States were a company, then Warren Buffett would come along and say, this company is just got great assets. It just needs new management reorganization, and it can be vastly more profitable. So I think the problem is on our institutional side. It's that we're in this kind of declining Reagan-era period where a lot of the Democrats, as well as all of the Republicans, have imbibed these myths about how government can do nothing right, about how we just need to deregulate everything and cut taxes. And so once we get beyond that to a new consensus, which if previous eras of reform are any guide, will be a bipartisan consensus. You'll have members of both parties supporting the alternative. Then I think that the U.S. Does have a promising future.
Well, it would be nice to see some bipartisan coming back to to some decision making. Go ahead.
One of the problems with bipartisanship is you tend to get an era of bipartisan collaboration when one party, which is identified with a reform agenda, like the Lincoln Republicans after the Civil War, or the New Deal Democrats during and after World War II, have pretty much decisively beaten the other party. And at that point, the party that is beaten divides into two factions. One goes along with the dominant party. That's what Eisenhower and Nixon did. They essentially bought into the premises of New Deal liberalism, at least with respect to economics. And the other part, like the Goldwater wing of the Republicans in the 50s and 60s, is just completely rejectionist. Right now, we're in a system that's more or less 50-50. Each side thinks it doesn't need to make any compromises. All it needs to do is get another 3% of the vote here or 1% there in a swing state. So I do think if one party, it could be the Democrats, it could be the Republicans, really does have a decisive, enduring majority, at that point, you'll see more bipartisanship. Let's hope it's bipartisanship in the right direction, not the wrong direction.
Mm-hmm. And tell us, before we let you go, Michael, how has your own background influenced your views?
Well, I grew up in the then dying New Deal tradition of Texas, which was the home of Lyndon Johnson, Maury Maverick, Sam Rayburn, and these other supporters of Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman in the New Deal. What has happened in the last generation is that this has been rejected, this Rooseveltian New Deal legacy, obviously by the Reaganite conservatives, but also by a lot of the neoliberal Democrats, who were saying that we have to repeal the New Deal, government is bad, we want to be kind of Me Too conservatives. So one of the things I've tried to do in my career is to keep this Rooseveltian New Deal legacy alive. Now, we can't go back to the actual particular policies of the 40s and 50s in many cases, but we can go back to the spirit of the New Deal and come up with something like its functional equivalent in our own time. It will be as different from the New Deal as the New Deal was from Reconstruction, but it will still be that same spirit of using the most advanced technology and economic techniques of our day to maximize prosperity and freedom for the greatest number of Americans.
Okay. Michael Lind, co-founder of the New American Foundation, policy director of its economic growth program. His latest book is A Land of Promise, An Economic History of the United States. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org, and we hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect Stand Up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with political scientist Norm Ornstein about the historic level of vitriol and lying, mostly by Republicans, that is now paralyzing national problem solving.
How a Supreme Court right across the street from the United States Congress, which everybody admits is broken these days, but how badly broken is it and what can we do about it? Nobody follows the Congress better, I believe, understands the Congress better, or writes about the Congress better than Norm Ornstein from the American Enterprise Institute. Does a lot of that good work with Tom Mann from the Brookings Institution. The two of them have written. I have to tell you, I've got right here in front of me two of the best books that I have read this year, okay? We talked yesterday a little bit about Nora Ephron and her latest book, I Remember Nothing. But by far the best political book I've written this year is this one. It's Even Worse Than It Looks. Norm Ornstein, congratulations.
Thanks so much, Bill.
Good to see you.
It's great to see you.
You look awfully sharp today, I must admit. Didn't we
It's
tell
for
you?
Really?
This is like the picnic, White House picnic. You have to dress down for the full court press.
You should have seen the Hawaiian shirt he had on.
Well,
earlier.
I'm actually just back from Las Vegas, and in fact, I did Jennifer Granholm's TV show from there.
Oh, cool.
But
yeah.
I made a confession when we first started that I was embarrassed to say that I was out there to give a talk, that I was staying in a hotel owned by Sheldon Adelson.
You were at the Venetian.
I was at the Venetian, but I told her I wouldn't spend any more money than I had to, and I took the soap. So.
And you've been a high
shampoo
roller.
too.
You've been a high roller ever
on somebody else's dime. Sure,
right? Good. So tell us how. Some people say, look, Congress has always been broken, and if you go back and read, I just finished Robert Caro's book on Lyndon Johnson. They talked about stalemate. Is it worse today than it's ever been?
It's worse than I have seen it, and I've been here for almost 43 years. And, it's not as if we've had these wonderful periods where everything works well together. We use the old cliche of people sitting around the campfire holding hands and singing Kumbaya. That's not how the system was designed.
Right.
But it was designed to be rambunctious and contentious and partisan. All that's good, and it's fine. The level of vitriol, the amount of lying that takes place that gets nothing but reward for it, basically, the tribal politics and the polarization, and in this case in particular, a Republican Party that has very consciously decided to act like a parliamentary minority, but in a system that doesn't tolerate it. All of that makes it, the title of the book is It's Even Worse Than It Looks, because it never looks pretty, but this is worse.
It's even worse than it looks how the American constitutional system collided with the new politics of extremism. And the refreshing thing, Norman, that I find about your book is you do really lay it out. And I want to talk to you about the hold and about the filibuster and these other ways that people have found to really obstruct and prevent getting anything done. But you also point out the idea that there's a false equivalency, that both sides are equally responsible here, is just simply not true. That it's basically the Republicans who decided they're going to shut things down. Correct? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
No, you're exactly right. And, there are no angels here. It's not like we have one party that's absolutely pristine and always wants to do what's in the national interest. They act in their own interest. But you also are there to solve problems. And when you've got a party that consciously decides that it does not want to solve problems, it wants to throw a wrench in the works because solving a problem would make the president look good, and the number one goal, as Mitch McConnell said, is to make him a one-term president. When that means problem solving takes a back seat, it's different. And we got a press corps that doesn't hold miscreants accountable in this case. And how are you going to resolve a problem, and how are voters going to know what's going on if instead it's everybody does it, they're all the same? It just doesn't work that way.
I love toward the end of the book where you talk about the press corps, you're talking about the media, and you make the point that there's not necessarily two sides to every story. Right.
You know what? I'll tell you, Bill. What motivated me in that particular instance was there was a piece in the Washington Post around the time, which you will remember well, when Eric Cantor, the House Majority Leader, decided for the first time ever to hold disaster aid hostage, that it had to be paid for, right at the time when we had these horrible floods in the Midwest, and then we had the hurricane and the earthquake in the East. And
this was the hurricane that went up to the Northeast, and we have this massive flooding for areas that never suffered hurricane damage
all the way up through New Jersey, New York, and other places. But the idea at that point that you were going to say you're going to have to either take money from Missouri, where the floods were taking place, to help to pay for disaster relief in the Northeast, or take it out of food stamps or whatever it may be. And Democrats said, no, that's not the way we've done things. We're not going to do it. And so there was a threat of government shutting down. And there was a story in the Post that said Democrats picked a fight. And I wrote a piece in the New Republic at that point that said, you know, just imagine you're a journalist and your publisher comes to you and says, I'm ordering you to distort a story to benefit an advertiser. And you said, I'm not going to do that, and you went on strike, and the story that emerged was reporters pick a fight. Is that accurate? It's like saying the hit-and-run victim is the equivalent of the hit-and-run driver, and that's just wrong. And I got an email back from another veteran Post reporter saying sanctimoniously, look, our job is to report both sides of the story. And I said, your job is to report the truth. And sometimes there are 6 sides to a story, but oftentimes there are not 2 sides, there's one.
Norm Ornstein here, our guest. The book, again, is It's Even Worse Than It Looks. So I'm interested, what kind of, because you're around the Hill a lot, you talk to these people, what kind of response have you gotten from members? Do they, Charlie Gonzalez, who was just in the studio, he saw the book on the desk and he said, oh, have you read that? He said, it's a great book, and he's got it absolutely right on. But how about from the Republican side of the aisle? Have any of them privately told you, good job, spot on?
I have not heard anything from current Republican members, although many of them are longtime friends.
Sure.
They've simply not communicated. Privately, I've heard that some are furious because, of course, this is the last theme they want pursued. But what I can tell you, Bill, is I've heard from lots of former members, Republicans who served for a long time, and for many of them it's, look, you're right, I don't know what's happened to my party. I'll tell you, one of the things that's happened here, and it's a larger phenomenon. This is not just Washington. It's not just Congress. Look how it's metastasized into the states. Mm-hmm. Look at what's happening even at local levels. I was just in my native Minnesota, where the legislature, used to be a paragon of civic culture. There were Republicans like David Dernberger, who happened to be at a book event that we did. And now you've got a Republican Party that's gone off the rails on the right, shut down that government for no particularly good reason. Look at what's happening in Pennsylvania with the voter suppression and in so many other states. But with some of the former members, it's almost like, all right, I served inside, and it's like I was in a tent where I was breathing in some kind of gas that made me think that they were the enemy, it's the tribal culture. As soon as I got outside and I'm back to breathing regular air, I'm thinking, what are these idiots doing? And that's partly what's happened is even good people, and plenty of them still serving, there are plenty of problem solvers in the Republican ranks. Has nothing to do with ideology, by the way. You can be very conservative and still look for common ground and solutions to problems, but they're forced away from it now.
Well, I have not been around this town as long as you have. Been here 16 years now. But there are people, on both sides of the aisle that I remember. You call them problem solvers. As I see it, they fought like hell during a campaign and then in between elections. And there was a period then, by the way, in between elections, whereas today there doesn't seem to be any at all. But people like a Trent Lott and a Bob Dole or a Tom Daschle or George Mitchell, they sat down and said, okay, what do we got to do here? How do we get it done? And how can we work together to get it done? Or in the House and in the Senate, same thing. I think Denny Hastert was that kind of out of that mold. You don't have them today. You don't have them today, certainly in John Boehner and Mitch McConnell.
No, well, I think John Boehner instinctively wants to be a legislator.
I would agree.
But a part of the problem is that he is simply boxed in by his own members. The kind of leadership he can pursue, and his other leaders are just ready to take him down. The kind of leadership you can pursue is where are they going, and I'll run a little bit faster to get out in front of them. And the sad part now to me is you look at Boehner, who, when he was first going to become Speaker, something he never thought would really happen, he was emotionally overcome, but he gave a message to his new members coming in. Look, we're going to bear some responsibility now. We'll be in the majority. There are things we have to do that we may not want to because it's part of our responsibility in governing. We're going to have to swallow hard like the debt limit. Now it's Boehner leading the way to hold the debt limit hostage again. It tells you how far askew we've come. And, of course, you've hit on a major part of it. It's the permanent campaign. It's all about how you gain traction for the next election. But in a campaign, the other side is the enemy. When you govern, the other side is supposed to be the adversary. And your adversary one day can be your ally the next. It's just a very different phenomenon now. And, the problem solvers are still around. But if you try to do that, the Club for Growth, it comes in with $10 million to knock you off.
Can you find a point or a person where this all started?
In the book, we point to Newt Gingrich and to Grover Norquist as two perpetrators in a way. And, I got to know Newt. Tom Mann, my co-author, and I started a project in 1978 at the American Enterprise Institute to bring in new members coming in the class of 78, starting in January of 79, for regular, informal, off-the-record dinners about their first 2 years in Congress. We happened to have a pretty good class and chose well. So we had Newt Gingrich, Geraldine Ferraro, Dick Cheney, among others. But Newt, from the beginning, had a fully formed approach, a strategy set with tactics on how you could overcome what was then the 24-year stranglehold that Democrats had on majority in the House. I can't say he was wrong about what to do. It was, I've got to nationalize an election and make Congress look so bad that people say anything would be better than this. But over 16 years, he created a level of tribalism, the use of ethics as a political weapon, a kind of language casting doubt on the patriotism of his the people on the other side, a sense of them as being corrupt. Frankly, they contributed to it. The Democrats had been in power long enough that they'd become arrogant and complacent and condescending. But all of that created a generation of people who totally believed it. Newt didn't. Newt thought, once I take over, then I'll be in charge and it'll all be fine. Then you take Grover Norquist and the pledge, and, I blame far more the people who took the pledge than Grover for promoting it. But you put those two things together, the hatred of government, the belief that the other side is not just wrong-headed but evil, and a pledge where you cannot raise taxes under any circumstances, and you've got a bad combination.
And the result is even worse than it looks. Norm Ornstein. But, of course, there's not enough to bitch about it. You're also going to talk about how we might fix it, and Norm does in his book. And we'll talk to him about that and get your calls as well at 866-55-PRESS here, the Full Court Press, Thursday, June 28th.
Radio meets television. The Bill Press Show, now on Current TV.
Yeah, and what do you get when radio meets television? You get the Full Court Press here, coming to you live coast to coast from our studio here on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., and we're talking about the mess in Congress, how bad it is, how it got that bad, and what we might do about it. Norm Ornstein is co-author with Tom Mann of a new book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks. Seriously, one of the best books I've written in a long time, and it just absolutely nails what's going on in Congress today. So, Norm, is there any way out other than getting rid of the whole bunch and starting with a whole new clean slate of people? Not all of the people who are there, but let's say the obstructionists. But, that's just not going to happen. So what can we do?
And, it's not just the people. And one of the things that concerns me, Bill, is that the public's a part of our problem here. The instinct is whenever anybody pops up and says, I'm not like the rest of those bozos, I'm not a politician, that person gains traction. Look at what happened to Herman Cain for a while. And the problem is what we need is politicians. The framers were politicians. You need people who are there to solve problems, who understand and
Through
respect
the political system.
and respect their own institutions.
Yeah.
Understand there's going to be some horse trading going on. Try and figure out what the other guy needs and wants and why. We're losing that. But the biggest problem we've got is this is not simply a structural one. And it's not simply the people there, although it's getting harder and harder to get good people to run, given what the Supreme Court has done with Citizens United and its progeny. It's a cultural one now. The fact is we've become a tribal culture, and it's reinforced by a tribal media and the social media that amplify all of that. We started, I talked about lying. Mm-hmm. Lying brings no penalty or approbation. If you lie and you get caught out, you don't say, geez, I'm so ashamed. You double down on it now. So how can you survive in a world where I just saw a survey, 64% of Republicans still believe that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq because that's the message that they keep getting. And almost 40% believe that Obama was not born in the United States.
44% believe don't know what religion he is.
Yeah,
the latest poll.
But if 40% of the members of one party believe a president is illegitimate, then it's illegitimate to cut a deal with that president. That's simply a problem we've got. So you've got to have structural changes. Because that can help to change the culture, and we've got to focus on changing the culture to some extent. That includes the culture of the press. But, to pick one example, the filibuster rule is the same as it has been since 1975. For 30 years, it was one of those things that often annoyed, sometimes enraged a majority that wanted to get things done, but it was used infrequently, only on a handful of major national issues where a minority felt really intensely. You could work your way around it. Sometimes it was a rogue individual, but it was more an annoyance than anything else.
Yeah.
Now, it's not the rule that's changed. It's the culture that says, let's use it as a routine weapon only for obstruction. We're going to use multiple filibusters on bills that ultimately get unanimous support. Use filibusters on nominations that get unanimous support so you can spread out the time and take away the most precious commodity of the Senate. The notion that you raise the bar to 60 routinely is not anything we've ever had in our history. It flies in the face of what the framers wanted, but the culture allows it. Change the rule, and maybe we can begin to change the culture a little bit.
Well, in terms of, I think the first step is informing people, too, and making sure that Americans understand what's going on. And you've done a great job at that, Norm Ornstein, with this book, and I thank you. Thank you for coming in. Thank you for writing it. We'll put a link up on our website. It's even worse than it looks. Hey, it's about 200 pages, right? So
yeah.
It's a good, fast read, but a great read, important for all Americans to know what's going on, and then maybe we can all work together to change this system, get it back to something we can be proud of, and government that actually got some things done.
Exactly
right?
So, and boy, we sure need that.
Thanks, Norm. Good to see you,
Bill.
my friend.
Great to
Come
see
back
you.
at any time.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Congressman Raul Grijalva, Michael Lind, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to